Did you know that the brain can literally rewire itself when you get into the zone? It's a place where your thoughts flow effortlessly, creativity skyrockets, and your potential for growth seems boundless. Today, we're going to be talking about how you can harness this amazing sweet spot in the brain and use it to transform your life. Welcome to another episode of Wellness from Scratch. My name is Marissa Jackson, and I'm so happy you're here with me today. If you're new here, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming content. Today, I am thrilled to introduce neuroscientist Bethany Rains, who will help us understand the science behind brain frequencies, neuroplasticity, and the elusive state of mind we call in the zone. Get ready for a fascinating deep dive that will literally change the way you look at your brain and what it's truly capable of. Now, neuroscience might sound a bit intimidating, but don't worry, I've got you covered. I'm not going to bombard you with technical jargon. Instead, we're going to dive into what neuroscience really is, why it's important to your well-being, and how it can create positive, lasting change within your life. And trust me, by the end of this episode, you'll understand how powerful the brain truly is. Bethany Rains, a neuroscientist who focuses on making cutting-edge brain research accessible to everyone. But before we bring her on, let's lay a foundation of what neuroscience is and why it matters. Okay, so what is neuroscience? At its core, neuroscience is the study of the brain and the nervous system as a whole, essentially the control of everything that we think, feel, or do. Our brains are consistently working behind the scenes to process information, regulate our emotions, and keep our bodies functioning. What I think is really exciting about neuroscience is the concept of neuroplasticity. This is the brain's ability to rewire itself based on our experiences, thoughts, and behaviors. This is, in my opinion, huge because this means that we're not stuck in our behaviors, reactions, and thought patterns forever. This means we have the ability to change the way we think about the world, which in turn changes the way we show up in the world, which I think in turn changes the way we view and perceive the world. So I think that is literally so powerful, and I think, that there are situations in life that are out of our control. There are many situations in life that are out of our control. But when it comes to the portion of life that we do have control with, I think it's really important to try and mitigate our negative thoughts the best we can. It just will give us a better life experience. And I know how hard it is to not be negative. I have negative thoughts myself. I think that it's a part of the natural human experience, and it just comes with our brains trying to protect ourselves. But I think that it's always good to try to strive for a better quality of life. It means you're not stuck forever. With intentional effort, you can create new pathways in your brain. You can create these strong neural pathways for positivity with intentional mindfulness. And some of the tricks we're going to go through today. I believe that understanding neuroscience is like understanding the manual for your brain. It can give you insight into why you react the way you do to things, or why certain habits stick, and how we can break unhealthy patterns. For example, stress, anxiety, or feeling stuck in life, those are not just about external circumstances. Often those things are tied to responses in the brain, almost like signals that are given off. When you understand the process, that's when you can start taking steps to feel more in control. Here's the part I know you've been waiting for. How do we rewire our brain? The great news is that small, consistent action can make the biggest impact over time. Little steps every day. Like I've been saying all along, just a little bit better. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to do a lot, but you just have to try, and you just have to try a little bit. Okay, so let's go over a few of these strategies. First one I have for you is practicing gratitude. Taking a moment, being mindful, focusing on what you're grateful for. It can release feel-good chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, reinforcing that positive mindset. when we're grateful for things, it makes you happy, it makes you grateful, it makes you in a more uplifted state. When I think about the things that I'm grateful for, I can't stay in a negative state because, well, once I think about my daughter, I just have to smile, because she's just so awesome. So yeah. The second one I have for you is mindful breathing. There's a method, I believe I heard on the Mel Robbins podcast. She's great. You can breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4. And you just repeat that, a few times, and you can feel your heart rate slow down, and you usually will hopefully start to feel a sense of calm. Another thing is trying something new. That's a great way to rewire your brain and have a different way of thinking, because your mind is trying to solve a problem, maybe not a problem, but it's trying to adjust to a new situation, which is always good. I spend a lot of my time, of my life traveling and learning different jobs, learning how to live in different places, learning different things that were different culturally. And I think that is a great way to be able to rewire your brain, because I used to be a really negative person, and today I am not so negative. That's due to neuroscience and making small changes every day. The next one I have for you is learning a new skill or hobby can stimulate your brain and strengthen neural connections, helping you become sharp and adaptable. Trying something new is great because you're adapting to something that you've never done before, and that can help your brain to think in a different way. So the last one I have for you would be to try and reframe your negative thoughts. This means whenever a negative thought enters your head, you stop and you pause, and then you kind of catch yourself in that moment, like, whoa, oh, that was mean, rude, whatever the case may be. You stop yourself, you catch it, and you say, hold on, how can I look at this, in a different way? How can I move forward in a constructive way that's beneficial, right? Over time, if you keep doing that, you're just going to start to naturally be solution focused instead of problem focused, which is a monumental change in mindset in and of itself. So if something like that is possible with small action every day, I think it's worth a try, So these are just a few ways that you could create new neural pathways in your brain. And that is really exciting. It means that nobody is stuck. It means that none of us are broken. And that is really relieving because, for a long time in my life, I thought I was broken. I thought that there was something wrong with me. I had a hard time in life. And I'm coming to realize that I am not the problem. I just needed to retrain my brain to think in a more positive, optimistic way. I'm telling you, if you do implement these small things, your life will change. I really guarantee it, because mine did. Okay, so how do we take these ideas to the next level? That is exactly why we're diving in today with our guest, Bethany Rains. She's not just a neuroscientist. She is someone who is passionate about turning cutting-edge research into practical tools that we can use to thrive. From rewiring your brain for better health to creating what's called a flow state for peak productivity, she's here to share her insights and will leave you feeling empowered and inspired. Let's dive into it. Do you want to start with telling us a little bit about you and your backstory for our audience?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Bethany Rains. It's kind of a joke because it's Dr. Brains, the neuroscientist. But yeah, I actually do things a little differently. Most neuroscientists work kind of in a lab, maybe for a university. I do some lab work, but the majority of my work is applied neuroscience. So that means I'm taking a lot of the things that folks are doing in the lab and coming up with ways to put them into products or programs, interventions, whatever it takes to put them out in the real world. And it's something I just really love because I've always been a bit of an agent of chaos. And that is most certainly what the core of my work is taking something that works really well in a very controlled environment and seeing how we can get it to work just as well in an incredibly chaotic environment.
That is amazing. I love that. That is so beautiful. What inspired you to use neuroscience as a tool for improving well-being other than pursuing traditional academic research?
Yeah. So obviously, I didn't even know that my career path was an option when I first started out. I was very much trained up in a straightforward way. I think what really started it was in grad school. The university I went to didn't have a traditional neuroscience program. And so my degree is actually in forensic psychology. And that is because I was working in neuroscience and wanted to keep going with my research. And a lot of the work we were doing was forensic and affiliated with that department. And so from the very beginning, I was not just thinking about neuroscience, but thinking about neuroscience in the context of things like eyewitness testimonies or eyewitness memory, addiction, traumatic brain injury, or the effects of early childhood trauma on behavior later on. A lot of those kinds of things that are tied in with crime and crime prevention. And from there, I did a lot of work with the military. They have a lot of similar issues. So I actually did my postgraduate work, my postdoc with the United States Army Aeromedical Research Lab, USARL, and started to think about the neuroscience of pilots and particularly air medical pilots, so Black Hawk helicopter pilots and medics in the back. Moved on from there to Hazelden Betty Ford, where I was working on addiction. And then I think where I really realized, wow, like neuroscience can really, I always joke, neuroscience can save the world, was when I started working for United Health Group, their R&D department, because essentially it was like a giant sandbox of, hey, we really like what you're doing with neuroscience. How can we make people better with it? And so that really got my juices flowing on all the different ways that I could be using my neuroscience background for wellness and health, in lots of really cool and creative ways. And I was really stoked about it. So when I left there, that's what I wanted to do. So now I do the same thing, but instead of working for one corporation, I work with lots of different companies, startups, organizations, community movements, all kinds of things.
That is literally amazing. Your story is so inspirational, and I just love that. How has your journey as a first generation college graduate influenced your mission to make neuroscience available for everyone?
Yeah. So I was the first person in my family to go to college, which was really very exciting, but also a little scary because I didn't know what I was doing, and my family was very supportive, but they didn't have all those like ins and outs and tips and tricks to help me out. And so I got a lot of interesting looks from people. I was a really good student. I loved to learn, and when I got into my professional career, a lot of times people were like, I'm surprised you didn't go to like an Ivy League university or something like that. And I always joke, like, I didn't even have enough money to pay for the application alone, like figure out how to navigate all those systems. But in doing so, I was always sort of a voice, I was always really interested in health and medicine. I was very interested in the brain and how it works, how it affects your mental health and your body. And so my family has always kind of looked to me as a resource in understanding their own sort of health. Like if they go to the doctor, what does this mean? Or I had this scan, what is this saying? I really kind of had that role and still have that role a lot of times in my family of how do I take something that's written in complete jargon and help explain it to them in something that they'll understand so that they're not so worried. Because what I really saw all the time, and I see this with people still, is like fear. You sort of, especially with our health, you're always sort of expecting the worst. And so, my family, they're brilliant people. They're very intelligent people, but they don't all have that formal education in science. So, a lot of that jargon is not helpful for them. And as I kind of got through and started growing in my career, I realized that that's a problem all over the place, not just with folks who maybe don't have as much formal education, but even people who do, but are in a different field or maybe somewhere else. And neuroscience in particular, it can be really intimidating because there's just a lot of that anatomy and physiology component to it. So people talking about the amygdala, the hippocampus, the corpus callosum, like what are all these pieces? What do they do? And at the end of the day, that's less important than just kind of getting a sense of how your brain works. What does that mean? And I think my favorite part about it is I've always kind of specialized in and dug a little deeper into things like evolutionary function, evolutionary psychology, evolutionary neuropsychology, how your brain evolved and why. Doing that has helped me kind of come up with what a lot of people refer to as like a functionalist perspective. What is the function of everything? Why is this happening? What does this do? And I've found that that's really helpful for people. But again, it's always been sort of limited. Like you're only talking about functionalism in like a grad school seminar or, a lecture at a university. Not everybody even knows that they have access to those things or they don't have access at all. So I like taking that out and thinking, how would I like to have this explained? Like, how can I explain this in a way that's actually useful? And there's a lot of power in that because people realize they're not broken. They're not, we have a really bad habit in Western healthcare to make everything a disease. Everything is very medicalized. And so people get this idea that I'm sick, I'm broken, I'm the problem. And, certainly there's things that individually we can work on. But for the most part, people are not broken, especially in mental health. Your brain is actually doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You've just faced some really stressful things in your environment and didn't get the right coping tools to work through them, and that happens all the time. I just recently put out a blog on neurodivergence and how so many people for generations have been taught that they're broken, they're wrong, their brain is messed up, they have some kind of a disorder, when really we're finally leaning into this idea of neurodivergence where no, the brain is incredibly complex. People learn super different ways. Function can go in lots of different directions, but we have these systems that were set up for convenience and mass production that if you didn't fit into those models, well, you were sort of made to feel less than. And really, it's a fault of the system, not a fault of your brain. And so I like to think about things in that way all across the board. And I think it's important for people to have a trusted voice that helps to walk through those things. And I hope that people would know I have their best interest at heart. And so that's a big part of my motivation for it.
Wow, that is amazing. And you're definitely speaking to me on the neurodivergent notes for sure. I have definitely been in situations where I don't fit in those certain boxes particularly well, push up against certain things in society that you don't necessarily mean to when you have the neurodivergence, I find. Um,
Yes.
awesome. What were the biggest lessons you've learned transitioning from a corporate research to founding Interocept Labs?
Yeah, Interocept Labs, which is named after your sense of interoception, which is part of your sense of touch. Interoception is how your ability to sort of perceive how you feel on the inside of your body,
Mhm.
and it's the basis of emotions and a lot of your kind of personal beliefs, actually. So I've always loved interoception and wanted to name my company after it. But yeah, working for big organizations, I mean, and I've worked for some big ones. The Army, Hazelden and Betty Ford is a huge nonprofit that's national. And then, yeah, UHG, right? It's a Fortune 5 company, it's a massive corporation. And so what I loved about those jobs was always the reach and the the fact that there was always a lot of problems to solve because they served so many people and they were passionate about what they were doing. Like, all of those positions really were right kind of in the thick of it. What I didn't love about working for big organizations was the lack of flexibility. I am a very flexible, you could argue slightly chaotic individual. I really like to sort of be able to approach each problem with what it needs and not have to follow a one size fits all sort of structure for problem solving. And I tend to have a very fluid, sort of organic approach to learning and to thinking and being as creative as possible. That isn't always what people are thinking of in like a corporate R&D structure. So while I did love the reach, I loved the opportunities, I loved all the people I got to meet and all the things I got to do, I would generally get kind of frustrated by the fact that by nature, something that large has to be pretty rigid in its structures. And it wasn't helping me to pivot and solve problems in an innovative way like I wanted to. So I took as much as I could learning from those companies, and I still partner with a lot of the large organizations I used to work for and others that are similar to them. But now, kind of operating as this smaller, very flexible, very innovative little spark that can help them do what they need to do once an idea is ready for that rigid structure without accidentally killing it or suffocating it before it gets there. So yeah, it was a journey and it evolved, but I'm really happy with where I've landed.
Well, that's amazing. So you're making ideas be able to be flourished in more corporate environments. That's cool.
Yeah, I'm taking a seed and I'm turning it into a cutting that's a little bit more ready for the outside garden. You know what I mean?
Yes, exactly. That's beautiful. Can you explain how people can use neuroscience to improve their day-to-day well-being?
Yes, I could talk about that for years and years and years on end, and I could just drive everyone here crazy. I genuinely think that neuroscience is such it's like an underrated player when we're thinking, especially about more modern approaches to mental health. Historically, there was a very strong, there's mental health, and there's physical health, and ne'er the two shall meet. They were treated so differently. I even had like old school doctors that I would work with that were like, oh, it's irrelevant what's going on in the brain because the blood brain barrier kind of keeps things out. I was like, no, nope. Nope, the nervous system is definitely integrated into the body. But they just, that's how they're trained to think. They're thinking in a very chemical sort of like, medical. I think that understanding not only how your brain works, how it wants to work, how it's evolved to work, but then also really understanding the impact it has on your body and your perception of your environment. I mean, your central nervous system is called that for a reason. It is central to your reality. It's central to your life. And a lot of people, again, they don't really get that unless you get, you have kind of a niche interest. Maybe you're seeking it out. A lot of the information that's useful in this is coming from journals where access can be limited, or it's coming from scientific papers that might be jargony and tough to get through, or you need to read lots and lots and lots of them to kind of get a sense of the bigger picture. And I love that I have access to those things. And I also love that I kind of grew up with the language that allows me to talk about them with a very broad group of people. So doing that, I've been able to sort of just chat with people and just kind of, did you know that your brain is supposed to do this? In a trauma situation, your brain is actually supposed to collect all of the information about the details. You're supposed to have avoidance. You're supposed to have a fight, flight, or freeze effect when you're around them because it's a survival mechanism. So, if you've had a traumatic experience, giving yourself a little bit of grace, like your brain is doing exactly what it's evolved to do to survive. Granted, it's inconvenient for a modern world, and sometimes the systems around you will be impatient with that, but your brain itself is perfectly healthy and doing exactly the right thing. And so how do we work within the bounds of that new structure of belief? Your brain's not broken. It's just misaligned right now with what you're trying to do in your ecosystem. I love that. I love thinking about things that way. And I think that's the most helpful for people. I'm not here to diagnose a condition. There certainly are conditions out there. They are diagnosable. A doctor can do that for you and treat them. But I think a lot of things in our lives are coming from a misalignment. And when I can help people to sort of understand, like, here are the things that your brain likes to do, and here are the things that are happening. Let's find the marriage of those. It makes me really happy. And I get a lot of feedback from people that it's useful for them. So that's a big part of just, again, understanding how your brain works is by nature going to be understanding how a lot of your body works, how your thoughts work, how your emotions work, how your perceptions work, your reality works. And it really can open a lot of doors and help people feel a little bit less lost or broken. And I'd like to think it helps people feel hopeful, which is naturally going to spark an ability to solve problems forever. So that's my goal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is so inspirational. Can you give me like 3 specific brain-based strategies for managing stress or anxiety that the audience could take away from today?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm kind of coming hot off of talking about neurodivergence. And one of the things I talk a lot about is something called flow state, which I think a lot of people are sort of familiar with, but may not know that it's actually a very specific state in your brain. And not only that, it's considered by most folks in the neuroscience field to be like optimal brain focus. What I find interesting about flow state is it's that sense of kind of really getting super deep and hyper focused into a task and losing all sense of distractions and losing all sense of time around you. And a lot of people who have kind of a background with like ADD or ADHD may find that they go into that state pretty easily. You're easily distracted, but you're also really easily put into flow. So ADHD is really just kind of a brain function where you're a lot of like one side of the spectrum or the other and not a whole lot of time floating in the middle. And what I found really interesting is I'll talk to people. My mom had mentioned it. A lot of people are brought up to believe that flow state is a symptom, that it's a bad thing, that it's like a sign that you have ADD, you have ADHD, like you're zoning out. And I find that fascinating because it's actually not a problem. You're able to get into that optimal state really well. And that state is a really great place for your brain to be. So what happens in that state is it's a perfect balance of like 3 things. 1, the implicit motivation to just do the thing that you're doing. You're getting like a lot of just general pleasure, satisfaction, a sense of mastery. Something is really rewarding you for doing that. And it sets off a nice little dopamine response in your brain. The other is a balance of skill and challenge. So your skill set is it's like perfectly challenging without going too far. It's not too easy to get boring. When those 3 things sort of all come together, you hit that flow state and your brain actually goes into like a pretty specific function profile. And one of those things is you start to see waves in the brain. If you had an EEG on your head while it was going on, you'd see what are called gamma waves. And they're these really high frequency, really small amplitude waves, and they are like super efficient communication between the different parts of your brain. And it really shows that like we're just trying to like we're knocking stuff out. We're very like intense, right? Getting there, but it doesn't allow you to really shift your focus out and multitask. You're really in the zone, in the task. What I found really cool is there's been some research that's come out recently that suggests that those gamma waves themselves are actually very healing for the brain. They kind of help with brain maintenance, kind of cleaning things out. So that's a really big one. And I think that a lot of people might not realize that if you can get into that flow state, sometimes I know it can get out of control if you're like, oh my God, I literally like, you don't want to get into it for things that aren't going to make you feel good afterwards. It's easy to get into flow state on things like social media. They're designed to get you there. But if you can find ways to get into that flow state with things for your work and your productivity or even your wellness and self-care, you're going to feel extra good afterwards because you'll also get the dopamine rush of accomplishment. So use flow state however you can. And the big piece that's missing for a lot of people in that balance is that implicit motivation. We're taught that like, if you don't want to do something, you don't want to do it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's actually not true. There's a whole reason why people will spend hours playing Candy Crush on their phones. It's not because Candy Crush is implicitly fun. Like, you're sitting there just watching ads and playing with blocks. Why is that so motivating? And that's because they're using a lot of neuroscience to boost implicit motivation. There's ways you can do that. And so I guess the number two thing kind of flowing into that like segue is play with implicit motivation and look up different ways. My favorite model is put together by a guy named UK Chow. He calls it octalysis because it has 8 different parts. He organizes it so beautifully. I studied the neuroscience of motivation and engagement for years, putting together like apps. And, you know, it's one thing to make a really cool therapy, but people have to want to do it. They have to want to engage with it. So there's a lot of stuff out there for how you can do it. And people are like, oh, gamify it. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to gamify something? And UK Chow put together this model, this octalysis model that like really breaks down what that means, and you can experiment with it. He has a book called Actionable Gamification. It's really easy to read. So I tell people, play around with like what motivates you. Whatever motivates you to get something done is not a wrong answer. Play with your environment. Literally play. Make it fun. Like, fun is not a bonus. It's actually a very important part of your brain's function. The reason that fun is so important to us is because we've evolved for that. That's an optimal thing. So play with things, be curious, have fun, get something to where you want to like it. We need to move past this idea of like, well, work is work. It's not supposed to be fun. Like, you can think that way and power through on pure willpower, but that's not how your brain was designed to work. So say that would be my second thing. That's very practical. And the third thing, let's talk about anxiety a little bit. I think what's really interesting, brain has its own sort of immune response. And a lot of people don't know this. And the little guys who are in charge of it are called microglia. And your microglia are almost kind of like the white blood cells of your brain. That's not exactly what they are, but they operate in a very similar way. And I like to think of them as like the National Guard of your brain. So when you're in peacetime, they're helping infrastructure. They're cleaning up dead cells. They're helping with neuroplasticity. They're helping like strengthen connections and helping break down old ones. They do a lot of really great work like that in your brain. But when you're in wartime, they're called away. And that is what we call microglial activation. It's like the wartime response. When they're out and away, they're ready for something to kind of like invade your brain because we've evolved for like pathogens, right? So yeah, it's a deadline and it's really stressful, but your body and your brain don't know the difference between that and say like something that might be an injury or something that'll hurt your brain. Mm-hmm. So they still respond as though something's going to infect your brain. And so when they're out and away doing that job, nothing's being taken care of in the infrastructure of your brain. So it would be kind of like, okay, all the roads are starting to kind of fall apart. The bridges aren't looking so good. There's litter everywhere. Like everything's going down. We're finding that microglial response and how often that you're stressed or you're feeling like on edge really ties into your cognitive health, especially later on in your life, because all of that stuff needs to get cleared out. So, for folks who are like, oh, I'm busy now, but later on I can calm down, or I got to work really hard now so that I can retire. That's not a great strategy. You don't want to stress yourself out now for later because it's really kind of affecting that infrastructure of your brain. So the more you can take little micro breaks, even if it's not going to solve your problem, but you can calm your body down through a lot of the parasympathetic kind of techniques we all know, making sure your exhales are longer than your inhales is like a number one key indicator to your brain and body that like danger has passed. And you can control your breath. So that's like one you can hack. You know, breaking away from hypersensory environments, putting on some noise canceling headphones, putting on like an eye mask, and just relaxing for 5 minutes in like a low sensory environment is key. Those little 5 to 10 minute breaks that you can take to like reassure your body will take those microglia down with it and help calm them down too. So you want to just kind of make sure you're not accidentally keeping your troops out there at attention at all times. So I would say, you know, we all know try and relax more. I hate that advice. It's so stupid. Like, yeah, well, if I could, I would. But I think people don't quite realize like how mechanical relaxation really can be for your body maintenance. And it may not be perfect. You may still have that problem there, but do your best to catch like those 5 or 10 minutes. For me, a mantra that's very powerful during those times is I don't have to be anywhere than where I am right now. Like I don't need to be anywhere right now. I don't need to do anything right now. Repeating that to myself in like a kind of a dark, quiet environment for 5 or 10 minutes has a profound effect on my body and my brain. So something like that works for me. It won't work for everybody, but that's just kind of what I use to help me get there, because that realization is very powerful for me as a whirling dervish of a human being.
I can definitely identify with that. And I also agree that I have some mantras I've recently introduced. It's like you ask yourself, may I be safe? Or like, and just taking those little breaks to calm yourself really do. They create a magnitude of effect over time. And it is so important. And oh my gosh, I learned so much from your answer. How does understanding the nervous system help us improve our physical health, such as managing chronic pain or fatigue?
I like this question. Historically, especially in medicine, we thought of our nervous system as being a way to transfer messages, what neuroscientists call bottom up, from the body to the brain. And your brain was just kind of there to like be the manager, be like, oh, okay, I'm getting this signal from the arms and this signal from the legs, this signal from the kidneys. And that's how we kind of have designed our treatment around things. So the assumption is when you feel pain is a big area that I do work in. When you feel pain, it's because the only reason it can happen is because there's damage in your body and the nerves are sending that message from the bottom up to your brain and saying, yikes, 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 there's damage. And that happens. That's a type of pain that most certainly exists. You touch a hot stove, you will experience it. Please don't touch a hot stove. I don't want anybody to actually test that at home, but we have a fancy word for that. The $5 word for that is nociception, or nociceptive pain, because the little nerves that do that, there's actually special nerves we've evolved that are specifically for pain and damage. There are little like, you know, emergency broadcast system, and they're called nociceptors. And so that's all they do. They tell us about damage. And for years and years and years, we assumed that the only way that pain happened was through nociception. However, as we've gotten much smarter about our brain, especially in the last like 25 years, there's a realization that the brain is actually not very reactive like we thought. We always thought things were coming up to the brain would react, and you would go. And in thinking of that, we're like, God, that doesn't make any sense. Our reaction times are too fast. There's no way it could do this. And there's a lot of unexplained phenomena. We realized our brain actually predicts. That's what it does. And that's what memories are for. We've evolved to have memories so that we can predict better. And it's actually what surprises as well. The emotion of surprise is what our brains and bodies feel when one of our predictions is wrong. So that unique feeling evolved to, it actually boosts your neuroplasticity a bit when you're surprised. It boosts your learning. Neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to like reconnect its little branches and learn something new, create new connections. So when you feel surprise, FYI, you're learning a little bit better for a minute. But with things like pain, or lots of things actually, any kind of perceptual experience, the brain can actually turn it on in prediction of something happening so that you're prepared. And this is if you want to think about it in a non-pain terms first, is how optical illusions work. When your brain is expecting something, it is sending that signal in advance to your eyeballs, and not so much to your eyeballs, but to your visual processing parts of your brain. And you're seeing something that isn't actually there, and you're seeing what is there at the same time. And we can play with that. We make games out of it, right? Pain happens in a similar way. So especially if you've had a traumatic injury or a traumatic experience that involved pain, your brain will remember that. It will remember that pain. And pain is really just a warning sign. It's what it's been sort of evolved to do. So it's just really a big fire alarm in our body that tells us, take your hand off the stove, you idiot, it's hot. Or like, don't do that anymore, you're hurting yourself. So pain is not necessarily like the end. It's a means to an end. It's just a communication method. when you've had something happen, there's lots of times when we see this. Like a car accident is a really great idea, a great example. That's not a great idea. It's a really great example. So it's a very traumatic experience. It has a very scary sort of sensory profile. And a lot of those things will now be tied to pain when you experience those things in the future, loud bangs or anything like that, or sudden jerking movements. You will likely feel intense pain because your brain is like, oh my gosh, last time this happened, we hurt ourselves really bad. Let me just go ahead and set off the pain alarm right now as quickly as possible so we can stop what we're doing as fast as possible. That happens all the time. And so what we started to see back whenever imaging started getting really good in like the 80s and 90s, they said, you know what, let's actually put people through that don't have pain and see like what their backs look like. Like people who don't have back pain, we believed that, oh, well, people have back pain. We look at them, they have herniated discs. They have all of this stuff in their back that's messed up. It's like weird imperfections. That's what's causing the pain. That's damage. We should do a back surgery. We should do this. We should do that. Or we can't fix it. Let's just give them painkillers because there's nothing we can do and their spine is messed up. But then they were like, hey, let's put people through that don't have back pain. And they did. And guess what? They had herniated discs. They had all the same imperfections. There was all this stuff messed up with their spine. And they're like, interesting. See, like a lot of these things we thought for years was causing back pain is actually just a normal sign of aging. So think of it as like wrinkles in your spine. Well, wrinkles are damage, but they don't hurt. They're just a normal sign of aging. Certainly there are certain it doesn't mean injuries don't exist. Injuries exist. But in most cases where pain doesn't go away after 3 months or so, the 3 to 6 months after your body's had time to heal, there's a very good chance that it's actually happening because your brain is still setting off the fire alarm due to other sensory cues that it has that it thinks are going to hurt you. And they can be physical things like, it's going to be really uncomfortable to ride in that airplane. It's going to cause problems in my back. And as soon as you think you have to, as soon as you sit in that airplane, your body's going to set off that fire alarm for a lot of people. It could be work. If you really hate your job, we find that there's a huge correlation with back pain or chronic pain in general. And so you're like, oh, I have to go to this place. It's awful. And like in a way it harms you. So your body is using that pain as an alert, as an alarm. And so they did some research recently. How often is this the case where people have no structural indication, but they have pain? It's actually like 80 to 85% of cases of chronic pain. And what we realize is it's that top down. I'm predicting that something is going to hurt me, so I'm setting off the fire alarm now. And what's been really cool, a lot of the projects I've been working on are now tackling chronic pain from that perspective of like, okay, what have we paired? What are the associations? What are the learned responses? And treating it almost like an exposure therapy where you're pairing things together and proving to the brain that damage is not going to happen when you are doing this thing, that you're okay, that you're safe, everything is fine. And what you see is in a lot of people, you see relief, and it's lasting relief because you're getting to the root cause of the problem as opposed to all of our attempts over the years to cover it up with like, painkillers or things like that. And, we see a lot of issues. This also explains why surgeries tend to have like a 3-month period where you feel better, 3 to 6 months. And then it comes back. And a lot of times it's actually a placebo effect where you're thinking, I fixed the problem, but you're not really getting to the root cause. And so we see people having to get surgery after surgery or treatment after treatment. So when you look at chronic pain, if you've been through a lot of repeated treatments and nothing's working or doctors can't seem to find out what's wrong with you, consider that it could be top down, that your brain is doing it predictively to help protect you. And what really needs to be adjusted is your kind of strength of association between something going on in your life and the likelihood of you being harmed by it. So it's very, very cool stuff. It's tough because people are like, are you saying it's all in my head? It's like, technically, all pain is in your head because everything we perceive is in the brain. So when you think of it that way, I don't mean it like you're faking it. It's very real. It's the exact same pain you feel if you touch a hot stove, but it does technically all happen in your brain. So
Right.
you could make the argument that it's in your head, but that's such a cruel thing. A lot of people have heard the wrong way, so I don't like to talk about it that way.
I kind of, in my perception personally, I kind of perceive it like your mindset will dictate like how you experience the world in a way, which creates the neural pathways which become more and more over time. So if you are doing things you don't like in life, they will create bigger neural pathways for things like pain or like discomfort or other things like that. Yeah. I agree with that. Well, totally.
There's a whole theory that talks about what you just said. It's called the theory of constructed reality. That we are constructing the reality around us based on a mix of some of the data that we're collecting, but also largely on our expectations and the things we've experienced in the past. all those predictions. So what you just described is actually a core theory that's really been helping to push forward a lot of our modern kind of neuroscientific advances.
Wow, that is so cool.
Very sophisticated neuroscience theory completely independently. So give yourself some credit.
Thank you. That's so cool. Wow. Wow. Okay. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about community and grassroots impact.
Yeah.
What role does neuroscience play in creating a thriving community?
Well, this one is probably the one where people are like, interestingly, tell me more. And a lot of it is really just, I see it as evening the playing field. Industry and business, people who are looking to make money and make profits, have been using neuroscience for decades. Advertising, marketing, design, user experience, all of that is neuroscience founded, right? It always really has been, or neuropsychological, you could argue too. And so what I'm really doing is taking those tools, especially trying to get them as modern and as up to date as possible, and offering them to people who are trying to do good and people who are trying to get support for beneficial community change. So, as opposed to just constantly using them for profit, which we see so often that we don't even notice it anymore. It's just become our normal. And a lot of times community efforts, grassroots organizations, they don't have access to those same resources. And that's what I'm trying to do. So when I'm working with my community, it's all about making the most compelling case possible and helping to organize and design an effort so it has the highest likelihood of success. And, whatever that may be. But a lot of times success is buy-in. People understanding the movement, people seeing how the movement is beneficial, people who understand how they can help the movement. All of that comes from a very neuropsychological place. Do you see it as a benefit, a reward, or do you see it as a threat? Like, all of that stuff is really going to make a big difference in how people react to your movement. And so it's really important to consider all of that. And it's not something that most community-based organizations initially set out to think, like, let's consider like how this is going to affect the brains and nervous systems of the people that are in our community. And certainly there are things that are very specifically, mental health movements and things like that, play in where the topic itself is neuroscientific. But anything that you're doing where you're trying to get a lot of different people together to agree, to understand, and to support, you really need a neuroscientist on your side if you want to do it right, especially in as complex of an environment as we live in now, because you have things like social media, you have things like 24/7 news cycles that are incredibly politically black and white. And so you're fighting against neuroscience. And it's important that you have somebody in your corner that's helping you navigate all that, because you don't want any of your efforts to fall flat because, they resonated with this group but not this group, or they were perceived as a threat on when it wasn't, and people were afraid of it, or people thought something bad was going to happen, or, it wasn't organized enough to where funders understood what the money was going to be going to, or people didn't understand how they could help. All of that stuff is what I do to try and help people to design and implement community grassroots movements that are super effective because they're really human at the core.
That is beautiful. And I'm from the city of Detroit, so I love grassroots movements and community organizations. That is beautiful. What are some emerging trends in neuroscience that you believe have the potential to reshape education for well-being?
Yeah, integration. Easy answer there for me. The understanding that, we've tried, old school science was all about separating things into its simplest components and something we call reductionism. And we're really moving away from that. And we're realizing you can't have a brain without an environment, discussing the environment's effect on it. You can't have a body without discussing the effects of the nervous system on it. And you can't have a nervous system without effects of the mind. So this old school idea of like, well, again, there's mental health, there's physical health, and there's an environment. None of those things, are related to each other. That's absolutely going out the window. And so it makes things messier for sure. It's really tough for people who have a more controlled laboratory approach where they're trying to figure out, does X cause Y or Z? And I definitely feel for folks in that. Love how we are sort of creating a system where things are phased, where, you start with basic science and lab science, where people are doing things in a very controlled environment and doing that reductionist kind of approach where it's like, what is the thing happening here? Is it this part of the brain doing this? Is it this? And we're answering a lot of questions there, but there's new levels now that are happening after that of like, well, maybe it's not just this causes this, but but like, let's look at the bigger picture. So I think there's a lot more like chaotic, good scientists like me who are looking at all that and like, yes, and this, yes, and that. And I see that really reflected in how we're approaching medicine in this century, in this decade, even this idea of, you hear about whole person health, integrated medicine, lifestyle medicine, all of that kind of stuff is all reflecting the fact that, we talk about there's the mind, the body, and the environment, or we talk about, biopsychosocial, and we talk about all of that. All of that plays into this idea that we really need to be taking, yes, let's still definitely look for if there are straightforward root causes that we can attach and attack kind of in that traditional medicine model of like, here's the problem, let's solve it and we're good. That will continue to be needed. However, complex problems are going to require complex solutions. And so neuroscience is really taken a boost there because I think we live in that middle world of function of the brain, but also like, how does that play on the body? How does it play on the mind? And so, all of that I think is really, really positive for the future of our healthcare. And I think we're really going to start to understand these complex issues that we haven't yet been able to tackle very well because we're starting to approach them from more, realistic, complex structures.
Wow, that was such a fascinating conversation with Bethany Rains. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What's one thing you learned today that you can't wait to try? Let me know down in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of From Struggle to Strength, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next one. If you've ever felt stuck waiting for someone's approval, or like you're holding back on what truly makes you happy, then you're going to want to watch my video right here about breaking free from external validations. I'll see you guys over there. Bye.